Hi, thanks for coming to REST to GraphQL from endpoints to capabilities. My name is Michael Watson, and I'm a developer advocate with Apollo. I'm really excited to talk to you today about REST to GraphQL because I've worked with a lot of teams on building their graphs from their existing infrastructure, and it's really common coming from a REST world into the graph. So for today, we're going to talk about REST to GraphQL, how to make sure we don't make our graph feel resty. We're going to figure out what capabilities to start with. And we're going to also talk about using our CRM as one of those REST APIs as a data source. Now, let's talk a little bit about making our graph not feel resty. And really what I mean there is we want to make sure that the graph what we're building isn't a one-to-one representation of our REST APIs. And you want to avoid having this CRUD feeling on your graph. You don't want to have, get account, update account, create account, delete account, because it doesn't really feel any different than the REST API. And one of the most common things I hear from naysayers of GraphQL is that the graph that they've interacted with doesn't feel any different than the REST API. And it typically isn't because it is a one-to-one mapping. And what I mean by that is that when we're looking at our graph, let's say we take this query, for example, it's just a hero card for their user, shows the name, title, little picture in it. If you look at the REST API endpoint that actually gets that information, it's basically a one-to-one mapping. The argument might be made here that, with GraphQL, you don't have overfetching, but at the same time, you're losing a lot of the benefits of GraphQL. This schema isn't structured in a way that makes it really easy and consumer friendly. So I don't understand what are the capabilities underneath this. This is just like, I'm just going to get the user and what do I do from there? Now, let's take a look at a query that is a little bit more graph friendly. So here we have a little bit more of an expanded query. Let's say it's for the active cart. You can see a couple things about this. One, at the top level, there's this user, I like to call it just a node, right? You can see from the user at the top level field, there's what I like to think of as capabilities underneath that. You have the profile, you have your active cart. These are the capabilities underneath what is the user in your graph. So now as I'm starting to build my query, I can start to understand that under a user, these are the things I can do as a user on this platform. These are the capabilities that I have provided. And this example query is just using the profile and active cart capabilities, but there'll be a lot more capabilities that probably go along with the user. And it becomes very easy to understand versus this CRUD feeling of like, get user profile, get user active cart, for example. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about that resty aspect inside of that schema design, the next step is really figuring out where we're going to start. So what is the situation? What's the use case? Are we just going to take all of our APIs and put them on our graph? Well, we all probably have a very similar common starting point. Usually you probably have some Swagger file within your organization, and it's a big file that has a lot of stuff in it. And a lot of times when I've talked with developers, they'll get overwhelmed. We have 700 APIs. How are we going to put 700 APIs into our graph? And the first thing I say is don't put 700 APIs into your graph. You want to be purposeful about what you're putting into your graph. You want to identify what is that capability that we're going to be using and creating. And then what are the APIs that are going to need to plug into that capability to make it work? So we want to be very, very impactful, and we want to be very thoughtful of what we're putting into the graph. So we're not just adding everything to add everything, right? And a big part of this is when we're doing a proof of concept, we want to make sure that we're picking something impactful. So that way, when we're presenting it internally to the organization, we're talking about with others, it's very meaningful, and they can understand that a proof of concept that's showing success in this key aspect of the business shows a good path going forward versus let's create an API that has everything. It's not really valuable to many people, and it doesn't get that same impact. So I always say start with one use case. And one of my favorite use cases to start around is the shopping cart experience. It is, a primary revenue driver for most applications. So showing success in this world really helps paint forward of, this is a solid strategy of where we're going. Now, in this example, just have, basic e-commerce shopping cart. The cart's empty. If you sign in, it shows your name along with the cart items. But let's go back to that query and start thinking about those entities and capabilities, right? So we had that top user node. I like to think of that as an entity in my graph. Entity is also a word that's used in Apollo Federation, but really there's this core entity user that is defined in your business, your organization. I use user because everyone's got users in their platform, their product, their whatever. But you have more things that are like this as well. And those entities have capabilities that come off of them, right? We talked about the profile. We talked about the active cart. And those are capabilities, and there will be more. And some of those capabilities will also be their own entities, right? The carts here, for example, those are going to be individual carts that probably have IDs, unique identifiers associated with them, but they're related to the user, who is really what is putting things into that cart, right? So there are one-to-one mapping inside of that from an entity to capability. And this is where you really have the power of GraphQL, because now instead of just having, these REST API representations, we can start to bridge these together to create the capabilities that we really want to power to our users. So if we start to build out this schema from the very first step, the first thing I like to do is I like to start out at a top level of my query, right? So we had our UI we created, or our UI that's existing. We have a query that's associated with it. Now we need to start building our schema based off of that. So the first thing is we have that top level node where it's got that user. The user's got a profile. That user profile is first name and last name. Now, one question I always get, for our user, we have lots and lots of fields on that type. Should we just add them all? Or in the user profile, should we add them all? Probably not. I would only add the fields that you need for your use cases. As you add in more fields over time, what tends to happen is there's fields that just don't get used. You add in some fields thinking someone might use these. Someone might need this information in the future, but they end up not needing it. And part of it is because there isn't a capability consumer scenario that actually needs that yet that has arisen. So I would recommend leaving that off the graph, and you can always add it in as needed when there's other use cases and things arise for that. Now with the user and the profile added, we need to add that cart, right? So we have to define a cart type. We have to define some items with the products to show that name and that price. And then we just need to add the active cart on the user. Now, one thing I really like about this pattern is we haven't written any code. We haven't talked about any code, anything like that. I think a lot of the efforts going into REST to GraphQL starts out with, I'm going to create some code project that's going to auto-generate some things. That takes a lot of time and effort, and it could be fruitful, but it could not be. Where that first step should really ensure this needs to be a fruitful effort. And of course, there's some stuff in auto-generation that might be needed. I don't think you should be auto-generating your schema. Maybe you start auto-generating things around your REST APIs and the data sources that are being created there. But the schema should be something that is meaningful to the business, not just based off of whatever the API's current definition is. Now, I always get this question, some of this data lives inside of our CRM. Right? Most CRMs have some REST API integration. The Swagger file we saw earlier, that is actually Microsoft Dynamics 365 Swagger file. So we can bring that CRM into our graph. One of the great examples I think of, from my past roles and experiences, everyone in their product, they typically have trials and things like that. Well, when one of your users starts a trial, you probably want that to pop up in your CRM. You probably want it to notify someone, do some things like that. So I think integrating your CRM into your graph is something I see almost everyone have to do. And it's a great example for us to look at a REST API. So let's take that exact query we had and let's look at what it's like to bring into our CRM. So first at the top level, we had that user. In our example scenario, a user is really an account, right? I can log in. I then have my cart. I have all my information. It's like a one-to-one mapping right now. So we're kind of adapting our situation to our CRM. And one of the things I think about that's really important here, a CRM was designed to be some generalized customer relationship management tool for everyone's scenarios. But as you get into your business, you have different aspects of your business that start to customize that CRM, tweak things, change things. You really want to have that bubble into your graph. You want all of that to make a lot of sense. And sometimes that means you might have to orchestrate multiple data source calls to give that behavior. And the benefit there is the client doesn't have to do that anymore. The consumers don't have to do that anymore. That's now part of the capability that's in the graph. So we're gonna have to interact with the accounts to get this user information from that. Now, with Apollo Server, we have what's called the REST data source. And this is a class that allows us to interact with REST APIs very easily. It has a couple of really nice overrides like will send request. If you need to add authorization tokens to your downstream service for whatever that API is, you can see the base URL being set there. You can also dynamically resolve URLs. There's a lot of nice things built into the REST data source that make it really easy to get up and running with inside of a REST API. Now, one of the things I really like about it is the REST data source provides all of your CRUD operations. So, your get, patch, post, put, all of that. Makes it really easy for us to interact with those various endpoints, right? So for our dynamic situation, they have accounts. We're just looking for the email address that's like that user's email. Now, here's one thing about Dynamics 365. We get this primary contact ID, which means we have to go make another API call to get some contact information. So you might have to add inside of your data sources multiple methods, and they might have to be used together, right? So we may have to take that contact ID to actually get that first name and last name. So there's kind of two calls inside of our data sources really to provide that one piece of experience. My CRM's probably got some limits and constraints around it. When I first started doing this at Apollo and started thinking about, how does our CRM interact with our graph and our world, one of the things you quickly bump up against are API call limits, right? I think with Salesforce, we had like 10,000 API calls a day or whatever their limit was. And, they scale their pricing based on that. So however many API calls you need, it's going to be more expensive for your CRM. So wouldn't it be great if we can add some caching in there? You don't want to have to build another layer or something, but one of the nice things about Apollo Server's REST data source is it's actually built on top of the data source interface, which has a key value cache built into it. And so you can actually set on individual, get, post, put, patch, all of those individual time to lives. So in our example here, our primary contact is probably not changing, right? Like you create your account, like you're just there. That primary contact probably never changes. Maybe in the future we have some like transfer account functionality, but for now it's just one user. So at a minimum, I'm just putting a 60-second time to live to cache that. And what that'll do, Apollo Server will take the URL from that request and use that as that cache key. So you can see from that URL and those parameters will be part of that cache key. And if we have a cache hit, we're going to be avoiding one API call to our downstream CRM service. So it's really nice to just be able to add and layer this in just a couple lines of code. I don't really have to think about how am I going to start caching, this one object? How am I going to start dealing with this or avoiding just paying more money for API calls? I will say I've been at a couple startups and it's very common in the very early days to just pay the money to upgrade your API calls because it's the easiest thing to do. Well, it'd be great if you could just add in, one like this and maybe cut off 1,000 API calls, Once we've created our data source, it's actually really easy to use inside of Apollo Server. So inside of the Apollo Server, we have the data sources as one of the constructor options. And you can actually provide various data sources. We just have one we created, but you might have multiple inside of here. you're probably going to have multiple APIs. The nice thing about this pattern is all those data sources will be on the context inside of all the resolvers. So you can quickly start mapping, individual fields, types, aspects of your resolvers to those data sources and those calls in there. It makes a nice clean pattern to separate your data sources from your resolvers and be able to use those in with each other. Makes it nice to be able to swap out data sources as well. Maybe you change CRMs. Another thing that I've seen in most startups is the first CRM you start with usually goes to, we need to hit the reset button at some point because it's gotten so much. This pattern gives you a nice, easy capability of being able to swap in another CRM and still have that same graph, that same schema, that same capabilities all implemented and swapping something under the hood. Now, one last thing I want to mention about that caching, you might have, hey, we're hosted all over, we're globally distributed, all this stuff. There is the ability to set up a distributed cache with Apollo Server. So you can set up a Redis instance, you could set up a memcache, you could build your own cache if you wanted. There is the capability to do that. And then now that cache that REST data source is using will all be backed by that Redis or that distributed cache that you create. So a really nice scalable way around that strategy as well. Going from REST to GraphQL, the first thing I say is you want to identify your use case and you want to choose something impactful. I mentioned the cart because it is impactful for almost every business, every application. So that's one use case I usually like to start with, but pick something impactful. Another common one, the homepage. Something about the homepage where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people see it. Now, once you have that use case, you're going to want to identify, with that use case, this is the query I'm going to make, and this is the REST APIs I'm going to need for that use case. So you're starting to map out, I need these data sources to start creating what this experience is. You're going to create the data sources for those APIs, whatever those methods are, add them in as data sources to Apollo Server, and then you're going to use those data sources in the resolvers. So it's a nice way to go through this pattern, and you can iterate on this multiple times, right? You can get on this for literally once you have your graph developed, you can follow a similar pattern like this for almost everything. You'll probably start adding in more stuff. This starts getting into how you're governing your graph, how you're making changes, how you're designing schema changes, everything inside of there. Now, I am the Apollo Federation developer advocate, so I got to address this. I always get this question when you're coming from REST to GraphQL, first time world. Should I use Apollo Federation? My general answer is probably not. You don't want to be, if you've never run GraphQL in production before, you don't want to be trying to learn how to run a GraphQL server and a router in front of that. Like first, just learn how to run that GraphQL server, and then you could migrate into Federation very quickly. If anything, I just say, just make the server Federation capable. All you have to do is just add the Apollo Federation package and just build the schema from Subscript schema. With that method, that you don't have to make any changes to your type defs, your resolvers. There will be nothing you have to do, and you'll be able to be a federated subgraph in the future. So don't really think too much about Federation now at this point. You're coming REST to GraphQL, and if anything, that GraphQL server you're creating will become one of those subgraphs potentially in the future. You can see how you might have a subgraph for a CRM service. You might have a subgraph for other things. That user in our example was backed by a CRM service. You probably don't have like your users like core in your CRM. You probably have something that's syncing like your main thing with your CRM, maybe using Segment or one of the other tools out there. So just something to keep in mind. You might end up wanting to be able to break these things apart, and that's part of what Apollo Federation provides. So very easy to just have a federated subgraph from start and not think about it too much of, hey, should we do Federation right now? Now, I want to leave you with some getting started materials. The Apollo Odyssey course is fantastic. I would highly recommend going there as the first step. Really great place to get up to speed on just everything GraphQL. We're adding courses constantly. You can get certifications now. Really cool stuff. Definitely check that out. There's also some other great docs links inside of here. Apollo server, all of that REST data sources, everything is in there inside of our docs. If you want to start managing your graph with Apollo Studio, I also want to plug Apollo Workbench. It's a tool that I created, and it's really about designing your schema. It's primarily focused on federated graphs, but it does work for designing an individual schema. I commonly use it to go through the exact pattern we walked through, designing a query, designing a schema, seeing how those things map up together. And of course, there's the docs for Apollo Federation if you are interested in the subgraphs and kind of going down that route. Well, with that, I really hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me. I really enjoyed it. And I hope to see you all in the future with GraphQL. And I hope you all great success in your projects. Thank you very much.